along that line, we're going to do a bit of a Bible study, on a short passage out of 2 Corinthians, and see how, as we look forward to next year, how we can actually be refreshed and revitalized, how we can be renewed in our faith adventures. Because God doesn't want us to be static, and He doesn't want us to be paralyzed in our lives. He wants us to have full and renewed life built on hope, fullness, and action. So before we get started, let me pray. Father, we're so thrilled to be in your presence. We're so thrilled to know you. And God, whatever's happened in our weeks, in our Christmases, in our months, and in our years, God, we give it all to you, and we look forward. We look forward to what you've got for us, what is in store for us in this place, in our lives, in this town. God. Yeah, Father, I just pray that tonight, that it'll be your words that are spoken from my lips. God, I don't want to say anything that's not of you tonight. And Father, I just pray that hearts will be open to hear your word. Amen. Amen. So I'm going to be reading out of a section from 2 Corinthians in chapter 5, and I just noticed that Iona's gone, and I was going to get her to put it up on the screen, so I'm just going to have to read it to you, and when she's back, she'll be able to put it up for you. So we're in 2 Corinthians verse 16 through to verse 20. Now I'm reading out of the New Living Translation because there's a couple of phrases that I really like, but all translations are good. So here we go. Verse 16 says, and all of this is a gift from God. Oh, have I missed a bit? I have missed a bit. So we've stopped evaluating others from a human point of view. At one time, we thought of Christ merely from a human point of view. How differently we know him now. This means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone, and new life has begun. And all of this is a gift from God, who brought us back to himself through Christ. And God has given us the task of reconciling people to him. For God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sin against them. And he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation. So we are Christ's ambassadors. God is making his appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God. Awesome. I'm just going to reread those first couple of verses because that's where we're going to start. So we've stopped evaluating others from a human point of view. At one time, we thought of Christ merely from a human point of view. How differently we know him now. This means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone and a new life has begun. Sometimes it's hard for us, isn't it? It's hard to explain what Jesus has actually done for us. For some of us, there is an obvious and tangible change in our lives. I once met a pastor back in New Zealand who was a former gang member and a former drug addict. And he had one of those miracle stories. So he had been kidnapped and was going to be killed as part of a gang war. And he was locked in a bathroom and everything felt lost. And he prayed that prayer, that last chance saloon prayer, that Lord help me prayer. And within 20 minutes from praying that prayer, he was back home, safe, instantly converted, stone cold sober for the rest of his life. And that's a pretty tangible change, right? That's quite an obvious transition from one to another. But for the rest of us, Christ working in our lives is more of a process. It's a progression into the fullness of Christ. So the writer of the letter to the Corinth church, Paul, had a pretty miraculous conversion too. So Paul, we hear in the book of Acts that he was a murderer and he was the leader of this ultra-conservative order of the Pharisees, and he had a reputation for violence. Jesus reached out to him through a vision. He was blinded before he repented, and then he did a complete 180 turn and started preaching Jesus instead of persecuting him. But even Paul acknowledges the slow burner progression that the majority of us go through. So here in verse 16, he talks about how differently we know Jesus now, how differently we see others because of the change we have had. That shows us that there is a change to be had. There is a progression to be had. We've grown to understand Jesus as we have dived deeper into his love. And we're made new by this growth. We come closer and closer to the fullness the more we know. How differently we see others now because we've stopped judging them. We've stopped seeing them through human eyes. How differently we know him now. Our hope rests in our knowledge of and our relationship with Jesus. Now, verse 17 is a brilliant verse. It says, anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. So anyone, that's all of us. Anyone, any place. All of us here, anyone who attends this church, anyone who attends a church within the town, anyone who attends a church in this country, anyone in the world who attends a church and worships God, but also anyone who has made a commitment alone in the quiet, kneeling at the side of their bed at midnight. All of us are becoming new. All of us have access to the Father. So anyone who belongs to Christ, but we all belong, don't we? We belong to a bigger family now as well. We're in our proper place. Someone has stood up for us to claim us as their own. We belong. Now, being part of a church family doesn't mean we get to be a part of cliques, and it doesn't mean we get to shun people because they're not cool enough. That's not what the church family is about. Church family is about intergenerational friendships. It's about love across cultural and racial divides. It's a place where all people belong and find safety and security. We see in Revelation 7 when the Apostle John is having his insane vision. And he says this in Revelation 7. He says, and after I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And they were wearing white robes and holding palm branches in their hands. So everyone gets to belong. And we're made new. We've been recreated by the Creator himself. Jesus creates a new way of life within us. A new breath is breathed in us. A new fullness within our spirit, and hope is restored to us. How differently we know him now. New things can be made from old parts, and they can make completely new things. We're not only upgraded, we're improved beyond measure. Verse 17, anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life has gone, and the new has begun. So if Jesus is the ultimate recreator, he's removed all of the old things, and our old ways are gone. We are free from everything that came before. Yeah? And that's not to say we don't do things wrong. That's not to say we don't get it wrong sometimes, and we may misinterpret God's voice or his plan for us sometimes, but we're getting there, right? We're not the finished article. It says in Revelation 21 verse 5 that he is making all things new. We're in a process, guys. It's a progression. Our lives are still enriched with this newness. The old is gone. But sometimes the old holds us back, doesn't it? We want to live in the fullness of Christ, but I don't know about you. For me, sometimes I get this nagging feeling at the back of my mind. It causes me to pause. Now, I call it the what if fear. Okay? The what if fear is like those gates at a railway crossing. Yeah? You don't notice them most of the time when you're walking under them or if you drive past them. They're not important until they are important. And until they descend, and then you sure as heck notice, don't you? You sure as heck notice when the lights are coming and when that red barrier drops in front of your car, when it's noisy. And all you can think about then is what's in front of you. You're not thinking about crossing that railway track to go and visit your nan or to go and pick up fish and chips. You're now just looking at the barrier in front of you. And you think of the possibilities of what if I'd missed the barrier? And as Christians, we face the what if fear a lot. I know that in my life, it's the thing that holds me back from action the most. It's my greatest hurdle to overcome is my inaction and my fear of it. So I was at this large event one time, and it was just finishing up, and it had been an incredible time of worship. And I'd had this amazing experience with Jesus. And as people were leaving, I felt God give me a word for a woman, and I just froze. I became paralyzed, and I had about a 1-minute window to go over and talk to this woman who I didn't know and offer what I thought God had said to me. But I missed my chance because I got trapped by the fear of what if? What if I'm wrong? What if it's not for her? What if it's offensive? You see, fear is an emotional, protective response to possibilities. When we perceive dangers, we become hyper aware and have to make a choice about whether we act or not. I spent my whole journey home from that event thinking not about the incredible experience I just had with Jesus, but about what if I'd spoken to that woman? What would have happened if I was right? If God had spoken and this thing was for her? And I guess I'll never know. See, when we allow fear to step in, it stops hope from being our primary source. Fear isolates us and makes our world smaller. It stops us from being the people God has called us to be. Fear is about inaction, but Jesus is about action. Verse 19 of our passage says, he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation. Now, a message needs to be communicated. It needs to be shared. And then verse 20 goes on to say that we're Christ's ambassadors. And ambassadors go to foreign lands. And they say things that aren't always popular in the places they go. Our actions must come from a place of hope rather than fear. Fear is from our old life. But hope is our new life. Fear isolates us. But hope makes us bold ambassadors. Fear is seeing with human eyes. But hope is seeing with God's eyes. Fear is full of uncertainty, isolation, and paralysis. Hope is fullness, security, and safety. The Bible actually offers some responses to different types of fear as well. There's a wide variety of categories for fear, but I want to focus on 3 of them that the Bible directly deals with. So first of all, relationship fear is dealt with in 1 John chapter 4. I'm going to read it to you. It's chapter 4, verses 18 to 21. And it says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Now we love because he first loved us. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother or sister, whom they've seen, cannot love God, whom they have not seen. And he gives us this command: anyone who loves God must love their brother or sister. So God deals with the fear within relationships by offering us his love. And his love trumps fear. Another one of the fears that is dealt with in the Bible is physical fear. The fear of the things around us. Some phobias are to do with this sort of thing. And it's dealt with in Psalm 46, verse 1 to 4. And it says, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though the waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God and the holy place where the Most High dwells. Even if the mountains shake, even if the waters rage, you can put your trust in God as our refuge. And that's how he deals with that fear. The third one I want to talk about is faith-based fear. So all of this stuff we're talking about. And it's dealt with in Isaiah 43, verses 1 and 2. And he talks about, do not fear. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name, and you are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burnt. The flame will not set you ablaze. So when we step out, God will protect us. Yeah. We are free from all different types of fear. We are filled with hope in place of fear. We have to defeat fear in many different areas of our lives, and sometimes we're good at it in certain areas of our lives and less so in others. So you might be really good at approaching a stranger and telling them something that you think God's spoken to them. You might be great at it, but you might struggle at talking to your family members who are a bit unconvinced. Or it might even be the other way around. There is this verse in Zephaniah 3, which is one of the least appreciated prophetic books, just by the way. Zephaniah 3, verse 17, which says, "It's the spirit inside us that is the mighty warrior and is our victory." So it's not actually us who fulfills the plan. It's God himself. Yeah? We're just the hope-filled vessels. And we have been made new by our Recreator and given a hope to act from. We've also been given a responsibility. I'm just going to read to you verses 19 and 20 from this passage, where it says, "For God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sin against them. And he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation. And so we are Christ's ambassadors. God is making his appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God." Awesome. The title of ambassador in this country is not an easy thing to attain. There's a level of trust required of a person to interests. They usually have to have a certain degree or a certain level of experience, and they have to live up to certain written and unwritten criteria as well. And it's a spectacular fall from grace when they get it wrong. And yet Jesus gives us all the opportunity to do that immediately. We represent him. We're reconciled by him, and then we're given the responsibility to carry his message to the world. And we proudly represent our leader. He immediately gives us that level of trust that an international ambassador has. We speak for him, and we take action for him as well. Now, this responsibility comes in every area of our life. It's not just for Sundays at church. It comes at work, and it comes at school, and it comes at college, and it comes with our friends who aren't Christians as well. It also extends to downstairs when the car park is busy. And it also extends to the queue at Sainsbury's. We have to live out this responsibility. So how do we live out this responsibility? I hear you ask. Well, I've got 3 very short things, I promise they're short, that an ambassador does, okay? The first thing an ambassador does, and that's what we do, is we focus on the one who sent us. We focus on Jesus. That is where the source of our life is, where our fullness of being comes from. So we focus on the one who sent us. Number 2 is we set some standards for those around us. We live in a way that reflects the hope of our God. We focus on the one who sent us, and we set some standards for those around us. And the last one is we point people to the one who sent us. We take action where we can, in little and in big ways, to show Jesus' love. Focus on the one who sent you, set some standards, and point people back to Jesus, because we've been made new. We've been given a hope to act from. We've been given a responsibility. I want to finish with an example about action and about inaction, about hope and about isolation, and about responsibility. And the story is set in the middle of World War I, and in America were following a policy of isolation at the time. So they had decided that they weren't going to participate in a lot of things that were happening in the world. So obviously, the Great War was occurring in Europe. And America decided we're not going to be a part of that. It's not too dissimilar to the way Americans are acting now in their international policies. They decided they were going to follow this idea of isolationism, okay? Because the war was happening in Europe and it wasn't anything to do with them. But President Woodrow Wilson had a different idea. He felt a responsibility to the world. And eventually, in 1917, he managed to convince the Congress and the Senate to allow them to send troops to back up the Allies' war effort. So 1917, America starts sending all these troops and they flood into Western Europe, right? And start to reinforce the war effort in mostly France and in Belgium, okay? Roll around to 1918, the 11th of November, 1918, just over 100 years ago from now. And the war finishes. The pressure of all of these extra men coming in allowed an armistice, and it allowed the Allies to dictate the terms of the ceasefire as well. Now, as part of the terms, they decided to set up this group, this group of nations that were going to come together and discuss the big things, right? And look out for the little guy and try and protect the peace and the hope of the world. And Woodrow Wilson, this incredible man, was at the forefront of all of these discussions. And he really wanted it. And so they set up this thing called the League of Nations. But at the very last moment, Congress and the Senate turned around and said, thanks, but no thanks. We don't want to be a part of this. We want to go back to being on our own. We've got our own things to deal with. The Depression was starting to hit and things weren't going well. So America pulled out of this agreement, but the League of Nations continued, and it continued for a while, but it just didn't have the firepower that it needed. It couldn't really do a lot without the influence of America as an emerging world power. And it collapsed in the late 1930s. And we all know what happened straight after that. It was World War II. Now, for a different reason, America becomes part of the World War a lot earlier. And in charge at the time was President Franklin D. Roosevelt. As you can tell, I'm a bit of a history nerd. Franklin D. Roosevelt had the same ideas as Woodrow Wilson. He knew America needed to be a part of a bigger community. He knew the responsibility they had as a developing world power, a responsibility to their allies. And so very early on, they became part of the war effort. 1945 rolls around, the Allies have won the war. And sitting at the table is America. And they have a second go at putting together a group of nations. And that group of nations is the United Nations. And it exists today. And whatever your politics is, whatever it is you believe about how good they do or whether they should be doing more or less, we can't deny the importance of the United Nations Human Rights Charter, the ability to give people freedom from slavery, the peacekeeping efforts that they do, the conservation efforts that they do. And it's all about this responsibility to one another. It's about giving people hope rather than staying away and being like, actually, I don't want to be a part of that. Because as Christians, sometimes we find it really easy to isolate ourselves. Maybe we've been hurt. Maybe something's gone wrong when you've stepped out before, and it's really easy to turn around and say, actually, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I don't want to do this. Maybe you do it for all these noble reasons as well. Maybe it's because you want to hear God better. Maybe it's because you do want to keep yourself pure, but you hold yourself back. The problem with that is we need to be with people. We're not made for isolation. People need people. This guy, Paul, writes a bunch of letters, and he writes a letter to the church in Thessalonica. And in the first letter he writes in chapter 2, verse 8, he says, we cared for you because we loved you so much. We were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. We care, so we share. Fear isolates us, but hope includes us. And we are Christ's ambassadors in this world. We've been given this message of reconciliation. We're the ones that he wants to make his appeal through. It's us. We can't be isolated. We can't let fear overtake us. So my questions for you is, where do you see yourself when it comes to hope and when it comes to fear? Do you feel full of hope going into next year? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. And do you feel like a new person? Do you feel like a recreated being where the old is gone? Or do you enter another year with fear and intrepidation? Do you let the things of the past hold you? A renewed life is available to you. And it looks like hope. And it looks like joy. It looks like laughter. It looks like hard work. It looks like action. But most of all, it looks like Jesus. And it's there for you to reach out and take. I want to pray to release some people tonight from their old lives. And I want to pray to fill people with a new sense of hope as we go into next year and a renewed fullness of being. And I want to release people into action as well, because you might feel all of that, but you still haven't had that go word. And I want to pray for you too. There's a few people I'm going to ask to be a part of that, but can we get the band back up just as we go into a bit of ministry? But I just really feel this is important at this time of the year. It's a great time to have a look again, to think again, to start hoping again, to start praying again. It's a really good time for that. So I'm going to be here. I'm going to ask if Ian will join me, and if Lauren will join me as well. And Steph is going to stay at the back. So if you don't want to come to the front, that's fine too. You can talk to her. But let's pray. Father, I want to thank you that you trust us. And even though we've screwed it up before, you still trust us to be your ambassadors in this place. God, I'm so grateful that you let me have a chance to spread your word. Father, I just pray for the people in this room who are feeling a bit down, who haven't had a particularly good year, who maybe need to sense your hope again, your fullness again. God, I want to pray that you touch those people now. Father, I ask that you move powerfully in people's lives today. That as we enter a new year, that they can be filled with hope and look at what a new life could do to them. Yeah, bless your name, Jesus, mighty King. Amen. Amen. So I'm going to be over here. Ian's going to go over there. Lauren's going to go over there. Steph's going to go over there.